What would you do if you came face to face with beings from another world? Run, scream, or would you fight back with everything you've got? For Donald Shrum, the answer was clear. He was going to fight. Today we're diving deep into one of the most intense alien encounters ever recorded. The Cisco Grove incident is a tale of survival, courage, and the unknown that'll leave you questioning reality itself. Stick around because things are about to get weird. September 4th, 1964. A crisp autumn day in California's Tahoe National Forest. 3 friends set out for what should have been a routine bow hunting trip. Donald Shrum, a 28-year-old missile technician, and his buddies were looking forward to a weekend of relaxation and maybe bagging a deer or 2. Little did they know that this trip would change their lives forever. The day started like any other hunting expedition. The trio hiked deep into the forest, surrounded by towering pines and wildlife. As the sun began to set, they decided to split up to cover more ground. Shrum headed off in one direction, while his companions took another route. But as darkness fell, things took an unexpected turn. Shrum realized he had wandered too far from the agreed-upon meeting point. He was lost. Panic started to set in as Shrum tried to get his bearings. Every sound seemed amplified. Was that just the wind, or something else? He spotted a sturdy pine tree with low-hanging branches. Perfect. Using his bow hunting skills, Shrum quickly scaled the tree, finding a relatively comfortable perch about 30 feet up. As he settled in for what he thought would be a long, uncomfortable night, Shrum's mind wandered. Hours passed. The forest was eerily quiet, save for the occasional hoot of an owl or rustle of leaves. That's when he noticed something strange in the sky. At first he thought it was a star, but stars don't move like that. Then he wondered if it might be a plane or helicopter coming to rescue him. But as the light grew closer, Shrum realized this was something he'd never seen before. It moved with impossible speed and precision, defying any known laws of aerodynamics. His heart raced. Was he hallucinating from exhaustion and fear? Or was he witnessing something truly extraordinary? As the object drew nearer, Shrum's initial relief at potential rescue turned to a creeping sense of dread. This was no ordinary aircraft. The light grew brighter, illuminating the surrounding forest in an otherworldly glow. Shrum clung tighter to his tree perch, a mixture of awe and terror washing over him. Whatever was coming, it wasn't from this world. As the craft approached, Shrum realized he was about to experience something that would challenge everything he thought he knew about the universe. His ordeal was just beginning, and the events that would unfold over the next few hours would haunt him for the rest of his life. But what exactly did Donald Shrum see that night in Cisco Grove? The answer to that question would spark decades of debate, investigation, and speculation. One thing's for sure. After that night, Shrum's view of reality would never be the same. You know that feeling when reality just doesn't make sense anymore? That's what Donald Shrum faced as he clung to his tree in Cisco Grove. The sky was about to reveal something that would shake his understanding of, well, everything. At first, Shrum thought salvation had arrived. A distant light had to be a rescue helicopter, right? But as it drew closer, something felt off. Where was the familiar sound of rotor blades, the drone of engines? Shrum strained his ears, but all he heard was wind through the pines. That's what scared me, he'd later say. I didn't hear any noise at all. This was no ordinary aircraft. As the silent visitor approached, Shrum's missile technician brain went into overdrive. He knew cutting-edge tech of the 1960s inside and out. But this defied explanation. The craft that appeared was massive, dwarfing any military plane. Its elongated cigar shape seemed to laugh at aerodynamics. How could something so big move so gracefully? But it was the craft's surface that truly captivated him. As it drew closer, Shrum noticed a shimmering quality to its metallic skin. He'd later describe it as taking aluminum foil and shaking it. You would see the glistening, shimmering effect. Shrum's awe quickly turned to unease. This was no rescue mission. Whatever this thing was, it seemed far too interested in him. Suddenly, 3 rectangular panels appeared on the craft's side, glowing with an inner light. A doorway? A window into whatever controlled this impossible machine. The panels pulsed with an eerie rhythm, casting strange shadows across the forest floor. Shrum found himself mesmerized, unable to look away, even as his instincts screamed at him to run. Just when things couldn't get weirder, the craft did something that would haunt Shrum's dreams for years. With a brilliant flash, the panels opened. But it wasn't aliens or little green men that emerged. No, what shot out was a smaller ship, sleek and agile. This scout ship zipped through the air with impossible speed and maneuverability far beyond anything human technology could achieve. As the scout darted around, Shrum realized with growing dread that his ordeal was far from over. The mothership was intimidating, but now it was clear. It wasn't alone in the skies above Cisco Grove. Whatever had found him in these woods, it was about to get up close and personal. 30 feet up a tree, Shrum thought he'd found safety. But as a flash of light erupted from the mothership, he realized his refuge might become a trap. What emerged from that blinding burst would make him question everything he thought he knew about aviation, and maybe even life itself. The scout ship burst out of the mothership like a cosmic bullet. Shrum's eyes struggled to track its movement as it zipped through the forest canopy. This thing moved with a grace and speed that seemed to laugh at physics. As his vision adjusted, Shrum could make out more details of this impossible machine. It was dome-shaped, about 30 feet wide and 20 feet high, with a small white light blinking atop it in an eerie rhythm. Now think about this. Shrum had seen plenty of cutting-edge tech as a missile technician, but this was so far beyond anything he knew that it might as well have been magic. The scout ship's movements were otherworldly. One second it's darting between trees, the next it's shooting straight up into the night sky. And get this, it did all this without making a sound. No roar of engines, no whoosh of air. Just silence. The scout ship's behavior suddenly shifted. Its erratic movements slowed, and it began to descend. With a final burst of speed, it zipped to the side of a nearby hill, about half a mile from Shrum's perch. The blinking light on top became stationary, as if the craft was powering down or waiting. An eerie calm settled over the forest. The constant buzz of insects and rustling of nocturnal creatures had gone silent, like the entire ecosystem was holding its breath. Shrum strained to hear anything, any clue as to what might happen next. That's when he heard it, a series of crashes coming from the underbrush, growing louder by the second. Something was moving through the forest, heading straight for his tree. Wait, what? Shrum's heart pounded as he realized the terrifying truth. He wasn't just an observer anymore. He was the prey. The sounds drew closer, accompanied by the snapping of twigs and the rustle of leaves. Whatever was coming wasn't trying to be stealthy. Shrum gripped his bow tighter, knowing it would be little use against the kind of technology he'd just witnessed, but it was all he had. As the crashing grew louder, Shrum's mind raced. Was it some kind of robot? Alien foot soldiers? Or something even stranger that his human brain couldn't comprehend? One thing was clear. His role had shifted from lost hunter to hunted, and the game was about to begin in earnest. The forest that had seemed so familiar just hours ago now felt like an alien landscape. Every shadow held potential threats, every rustle of leaves a possible attacker. Shrum steeled himself for what was to come, knowing that the next few moments could change his life, and possibly human history, forever. The forest fell silent, but Shrum's racing heartbeat seemed to echo through the trees. Then movement caught his eye. What emerged from the shadows defied everything he thought he knew about life on Earth. How do you react when you're face to face with something that shouldn't exist? Two figures materialized from the darkness, their silvery forms catching the moonlight. As they drew closer, Shrum realized these beings were far from anything he'd ever encountered. They stood about 5 feet tall, encased in seamless metallic suits that shimmered with an otherworldly glow. Their faces sported large, goggle-like structures instead of eyes, giving them an insectoid appearance. As the beings moved, Shrum noticed an eerie grace to their movements. They glided rather than walked, their long, slender fingers reaching out to examine the vegetation. Despite his terror, Shrum couldn't help but feel a spark of curiosity. What were these creatures doing? Why were they here? The humanoid's behavior was bizarrely methodical. They carefully picked leaves from nearby plants, placing bits of soil and vegetation into small tubes they carried. It was as if they were conducting some kind of scientific survey. Could these beings be here to study Earth? Suddenly, a series of hoots, eerily resembling an owl's call, broke the silence. The beings seemed to respond, their actions becoming more purposeful. Were they communicating with each other? Or perhaps with the ship that brought them here? As the humanoids continued their strange harvest, they moved closer to Shrum's tree. His heart raced, panic threatening to overwhelm him. He gripped his bow tighter, knowing it would likely be useless but desperate for any sense of security. The beings paused at the base of Shrum's tree, their goggle-like eyes scanning upward. For a moment that felt like an eternity, Shrum found himself staring directly into those impossible eyes, big as silver dollars, reflecting the moonlight with an unnatural gleam. As quickly as it began, the moment passed. The humanoids returned to their examination of the forest floor, seemingly uninterested in the terrified human watching from above. Shrum's relief was short-lived, however. A new sound caught his attention, something mechanical approaching through the underbrush. Shrum's gaze darted between the humanoids and the source of the new noise. It was clear these beings weren't working alone. Whatever was coming, Shrum had a sinking feeling that his ordeal was far from over. The night was young, and the forest held more secrets yet to be revealed. Just when Shrum thought things couldn't get any weirder, the forest revealed its most bizarre secret yet. A pair of glowing reddish-orange eyes pierced the darkness, illuminating a face that seemed straight out of a nightmare. This wasn't like the humanoids he'd seen earlier. This thing wasn't even alive. The robot-like being moved with an unsettling mechanical precision. Its body was clearly artificial, with a sleek, metallic sheen reflecting the moonlight. The lower part of its face featured a square, hinged jaw that moved up and down with an audible clank. Those eyes held Shrum's attention, two fiery orbs that seemed to burn with an otherworldly intelligence. Shrum's mind raced. He'd worked with advanced technology as a missile technician. But this was beyond anything he could have imagined. The robot's very existence challenged everything he thought he knew about the limits of science and technology. The mechanical entity joined the humanoids at the base of Shrum's tree, its fiery gaze sweeping upward. Shrum realized he was no longer just observing something strange. He was being hunted by beings that defied explanation. Was this some kind of standard alien exploration team? A biological being, an artificial intelligence, and something in between? The robot's movements became more focused as it approached the tree. Its head tilted upward, those hellish eyes locking onto Shrum's position. He held his breath, praying that somehow he'd remain hidden. But deep down, he knew it was futile. Whatever this thing was, it had found him. With a whir of servos, the robot's square jaw began to open. Shrum watched in horror, his mind racing with possibilities. Was it about to speak? To attack? He gripped his bow tighter, knowing it would likely be useless against this mechanical monstrosity, but desperate for any form of defense. What happened next defied all logic. A strange white vapor began to pour from the robot's open mouth, quickly filling the air around the tree. Was this some kind of weapon? A form of communication? Or something even more sinister? As the vapor rose towards him, Shrum realized with growing dread that his fight for survival was about to begin in earnest. He'd gone from lost hunter to unwilling participant in a cosmic encounter that would challenge the very foundations of what he thought possible. And as the mist enveloped him, one thing became crystal clear. The night was far from over, and his ordeal was only just beginning. The mist crept higher, and Shrum realized this was no alien smoke show. It was a calculated attack. But why target one lost hunter? The answer might be worse than he could imagine. Perched 30 feet up a tree, Shrum's options were limited as the vapor closed in. His first instinct was to hold his breath. But he knew that wouldn't last. The mist reached him, and he braced for the worst. But there was no choking or burning. It was odorless and colorless. That moment of relief vanished fast. Shrum's vision blurred, the forest melting into a swirl of shapes. His limbs felt heavy, and dizziness hit him like a wave. He clung tighter to the branch, knowing a fall could be fatal. Through the haze, Shrum noticed the entities and robot still at the tree's base. They seemed to be waiting, watching his struggle. A chill ran down his spine. This wasn't just an attack, it was a test. As the effects intensified, Shrum's grip on reality slipped. The forest pulsed with weird energy. Were the trees always that color? Did stars usually move like that? He couldn't tell if these were hallucinations or if the gas was showing him something hidden. Shrum tried to focus on staying in the tree, wedging himself into a secure spot. But as darkness crept in, he knew it was a losing battle. The world tilted and spun. His eyelids grew heavy, each blink lasting longer than the last. With a final gasp, Shrum lost the fight. His body went limp, held only by the branches he'd chosen as refuge. As he faded out, one terrifying question burned. What would happen next? The forest fell silent except for branches creaking under Shrum's weight. The entities below stood motionless, their gaze fixed on their helpless target. Whatever plan they had, it was entering its next phase, and Donald Shrum, trapped in chemical oblivion, was at their mercy. Donald Shrum was about to find out how to defend himself against aliens with nothing but a hunting knife and a box of matches. As he shook off the effects of the gas, he realized this wasn't a fight he could win with brute force alone. Shrum's eyes snapped open, his heart pounding. The aliens were climbing his tree. Panic surged through him as his safe haven became a potential trap. His body went into survival mode. He began shaking the tree violently, using his whole weight to create a swaying motion. The entities below stumbled, their inhuman limbs struggling to maintain their grip. It worked, but for how long? Shrum's mind raced. cataloging his resources: a knife, a nearly empty canteen, some rope, and matches. Not much against otherworldly invaders, but desperation breeds ingenuity, right? He quickly fashioned his belt into a makeshift harness. This gave him the freedom to move and fight without fear of falling. As he secured himself, Shrum thought about the irony. A missile technician used to cutting-edge tech, now reduced to the most primitive warfare. The entities regrouped, their emotionless faces turned upward. Shrum grabbed loose branches and hurled them down with all his might. The satisfying thunk of wood against metal gave him hope. These things could be hurt, or at least slowed down. As hours passed, exhaustion set in. Every shadow became a threat, every rustle a sign of impending attack. His supplies dwindled alarmingly fast. How long could he hold out? Just when hope seemed lost, Shrum noticed something strange. During one frantic attempt to drive the entities back, he knocked over his matchbox. As a flame sputtered to life on the forest floor, the aliens recoiled. They feared fire. A wild idea formed. With trembling hands, he lit another match, holding it out like a tiny torch. The effect was immediate. The entities backed away, their metallic bodies reflecting the flickering light. It wasn't much, but it leveled the playing field, if only for a moment. Shrum clung to his advantage, but a grim realization set in. The night was far from over, and his matches were limited. Each flame was a temporary reprieve, but also brought him closer to having nothing left to fight with. The forest fell silent, the entities retreating to regroup. Shrum caught his breath and took stock. He had survived the first wave, but at what cost? And what new horrors did the rest of the night hold? Shrum's crazy idea was working. The arrow struck the robot's metallic chest, and a brilliant flash of light erupted on impact. It was like hitting a live wire. The robot stumbled, its movements suddenly jerky. Shrum's jaw dropped. His primitive weapon had actually damaged this being from beyond the stars. Talk about irony. Here he was, a missile technician, relying on technology older than gunpowder. The other entities seemed just as shocked. They gathered around their fallen comrade, looking almost concerned. Shrum didn't waste time wondering about alien emotions. He was already reaching for another arrow. He fired again and again, each shot finding its mark with deadly accuracy. The forest echoed with impacts and crackling energy. But as the initial elation faded, a grim realization set in. Despite the hits and obvious damage, the robot kept coming. It was slower now, glitchy and unpredictable, but still advancing. And Shrum's quiver was starting to feel alarmingly light. The humanoid entities had retreated to a safe distance, but their eyes never left Shrum. He could almost feel their cold calculation. They were studying him, learning from each attack. Wait, what if this was all some kind of test? One with deadly consequences if he failed. As Shrum reached for another arrow, his muscles screamed in protest. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by bone-deep exhaustion. How long had he been fighting? Hours, days. Time had lost all meaning in this surreal battle. The robot stumbled forward again, its metal body now scarred and dented. But those fiery eyes still burned with otherworldly determination. Shrum raised his bow, knowing each shot could be his last. A chilling thought crossed his mind. What if he ran out of arrows before they gave up? What then? The night was far from over, and both sides were feeling the toll of this impossible conflict. Shrum steeled himself for what was to come, knowing his fight for survival was far from over. Let's find out if he has what it takes to outlast these cosmic invaders. You'd think shooting aliens with a bow and arrow would be the craziest part of Don Shrum's night. But But what came next makes his archery skills look downright mundane. As dawn inched closer, Shrum found himself considering an option so desperate, it's hard to believe it crossed his mind at all. The night stretched on, each hour blending into the next. Shrum's world narrowed to a brutal cycle of attack and defense. The entities below never tired, their inhuman patience a stark contrast to Shrum's fading strength. Every time he thought he'd driven them back, they regrouped and tried again. Gas attacks came in waves, leaving Shrum disoriented. He'd shake it off, only to find the robot or humanoids climbing the tree again. His defensive measures dwindled. Branches and debris rained down, but there was always less to throw. The matches were almost gone, each flame a reminder of how little he had left. Exhaustion set in. The forest warped and shifted, shadows taking on menacing forms. Was that movement just moonlight, or another alien approach? Shrum's thoughts turned to his family. What were they doing? Did they know he was missing? The idea that he might never see them again hit him hard. The entities grew more determined, their tactics evolving. Shrum realized with dread that this was a war of attrition, and he was losing. His human limitations were painfully clear against these tireless, otherworldly foes. As pre-dawn light teased the horizon, Shrum felt a surge of hope. If he could hold out until sunrise, maybe the aliens would retreat. But reality set in. He was running on fumes, his body pushed beyond its limits. Even if the entities left, how would he get down? In this moment of despair, a truly desperate thought entered Shrum's mind. He eyed the ground below, considering the unthinkable. I even thought about just jumping off down the canyon and killing myself, he'd later admit. Ending it all suddenly seemed like an option. Shrum's hand tightened on a branch, his body tensing. Would a quick end be better than whatever the aliens had planned? But before he could act, something changed. The entities below moved with new purpose, gathering at the base of the tree. His survival instinct kicked in, overriding exhaustion and despair. Whatever was coming, he wasn't going down without a fight. As Shrum braced himself for what he was sure would be the final assault, he had no way of knowing that the most bizarre and terrifying part of his ordeal was yet to come. As dawn approached, the entities below Shrum's tree perch were about to demonstrate some cosmic teamwork that would make your head spin. The forest fell eerily silent. Shrum's bleary eyes struggled to focus on the scene unfolding below. The two robotic entities, their metallic bodies now scarred and dented from his arrows, faced each other at the base of the tree. It was like some bizarre alien standoff, but Shrum knew better than to hope they'd take each other out. A low hum filled the air, vibrating through the tree and setting Shrum's teeth on edge. Tendrils of energy began to crackle between the robots, arcing from one to the other in a mesmerizing display. The air itself seemed to thicken, charged with an otherworldly power that made the hair on Shrum's arms stand on end. Shrum's exhausted mind raced. What were they doing? Some kind of alien recharge? A last-ditch effort to reach him? Or something far worse? He'd seen these beings do impossible things throughout the night. But this felt different. The energy buildup intensified, the space between the robots now a writhing mass of light and vapor. With a sound like reality itself tearing apart, a massive surge of energy erupted from the robots. It engulfed the tree in seconds, bathing everything in a blinding, otherworldly light. Shrum felt the vapor hit him like a physical force, driving the air from his lungs and sending his senses into overdrive. Every nerve in Shrum's body seemed to fire at once. His vision swam, the world around him dissolving into a kaleidoscope of impossible colors. He could taste metal on his tongue, smell ozone in the air. Through the haze of sensory overload, Shrum's last conscious thoughts were a jumble of fear and awe. As the energy pulsed through him, Shrum felt his grip on consciousness slipping away. The last thing Shrum saw before darkness claimed him was the forest itself, seeming to warp and bend around the surging energy. Then mercifully, everything went black. Silence. Complete and utter silence. That's what greeted Shrum as consciousness slowly returned. His eyes fluttered open, squinting against the pale light of dawn. For a moment he thought he must be dreaming. The forest was still, peaceful even. No sign of the chaos that had engulfed him just moments, hours ago. With agonizing slowness, Shrum's battered body registered his surroundings. He was still in the tree, his makeshift harness having kept him from falling during his blackout. But as he peered down at the forest floor, his breath caught in his throat. The entities were gone. No robots, no humanoids, no signs of the cosmic battle that had raged through the night. Had it all been some kind of hallucination, a vivid nightmare brought on by fear and exhaustion? But the aches in Shrum's body, the scorch marks on the tree, the scattered arrows below, all spoke to the reality of what he'd endured. As the first rays of true sunlight began to filter through the trees, Shrum allowed himself a moment of relief. He'd survived. Against all odds, against beings from beyond the stars, he'd made it through the night. But as he began the slow, painful process of descending from his arboreal refuge, a chilling realization set in. This wasn't over. The physical ordeal might have ended, but Shrum's journey, his battle to understand and come to terms with what he'd experienced, was only just beginning. Shrum's feet touched solid ground, but he felt anything but grounded. The forest looked the same, yet something deep within him had changed. What scars did this cosmic encounter leave behind? As he stumbled back to camp, Shrum's appearance told the tale. Torn clothes, singed hair, cuts and bruises, all evidence of his desperate treetop defense. But it was the haunted look in his eyes that truly set him apart. His companion's relief quickly turned to confusion. Shrum's frantic attempts to explain flying saucers and robotic beings sounded like madness. Their skeptical glances only added to his growing sense of isolation. In the days that followed, Shrum's mind raced with health concerns. Every unexplained ache sent waves of panic through him. Was he contaminated with alien radiation? The fear of some hidden otherworldly affliction became another burden to bear. As weeks passed, the full weight of Shrum's trauma settled in. Night terrors jolted him awake. Even awake, he was constantly on edge. Ordinary sounds took on new, terrifying meanings. His son Dan would later recount how the hooting of owls would trigger panic attacks in Donald. A persistent, loud buzzing in his ears had Shrum anxiously scanning the skies. The impact on Shrum's life was devastating. His once steady hands now shook uncontrollably, leading to his termination as a welder. The family teetered on the brink of financial ruin. The incident robbed Shrum of simple joys, too. It almost completely stopped me from hunting, he admitted years later. The forests that once brought solace now filled him with dread. As time passed, it became clear that Donald Shrum's battle was far from over. The physical wounds might heal, but the invisible scars ran deep. Shrum had survived an encounter with the unknown, but at what cost? And as he struggled to reconcile his experience with a disbelieving world, Shrum couldn't shake the feeling that his ordeal was only beginning. Wait, what? How could things possibly get worse from here? Let's find out. You'd think having the Air Force take interest in your alien encounter would be validating. Not for Donald Shrum. As he sat across from stone-faced investigators, he realized something chilling. They weren't there to help him. They were there to make his story disappear. It started with a knock on the door. Two men in crisp Air Force uniforms stood on Shrum's porch, their faces a mask of professional detachment. "Captain McCloy and Sergeant Barnes," they said, from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. Shrum's heart raced. Finally, someone was taking him seriously. But as the questioning began, Shrum's hope turned to frustration. The investigator's tone was skeptical, bordering on hostile. They suggested ridiculous alternatives: weapons tests, intoxication, even teenage pranks. Shrum's anger grew. He knew what he'd seen, what he'd experienced, the terror, the exhaustion, the desperate fight for survival. It had all been real. Then Shrum noticed something odd. The investigator seemed less interested in his encounter and more focused on who he'd told about it. It was as if they were trying to contain the story rather than understand it. The moment that confirmed Shrum's suspicions came when Captain McCloy asked to see the arrows he'd used against the robotic beings. Before Shrum could object, the arrows were bagged and tagged, whisked away as evidence. Shrum's protests fell on deaf ears. The Air Force men assured him they'd return the arrows once their analysis was complete. But something in their eyes told Shrum he'd never see that evidence again. Weeks passed with no word from the Air Force. Shrum's calls went unanswered, his letters returned unopened. It was as if the entire investigation had vanished into thin air, much like the beings he'd encountered that night. Unable to let it go, Shrum returned to Cisco Grove. What he found there shook him to his core. The forest looked different. The tree he'd spent that terrifying night in was gone, along with several others around it. The ground showed signs of recent activity: tire tracks, disturbed earth, and a conspicuous lack of debris. It was as if someone had scrubbed the entire area clean, erasing any trace of the otherworldly encounter. As Shrum stood in the eerily altered clearing, a chill ran down his spine. The cover-up was real. Whatever had happened that night, whatever he'd seen, there were powerful forces working to keep it hidden. The battle for the truth was just beginning, and Shrum was starting to realize just how outmatched he might be. After years of silence, Shrum finally decided to tell his story. The world wasn't ready for what he had to say. For decades, Donald Shrum carried the weight of his encounter alone. The memory of that night in Cisco Grove haunted him, but fear kept him quiet. It wasn't until the early 2000s that Shrum finally broke his silence. With his family's support, he reached out to UFO researchers and started documenting his experience in detail. The reaction was intense. Sure, some folks dismissed him as a crackpot. But here's where it gets interesting. Serious UFO investigators were drawn to Shrum's account. Why? The depth and consistency of his story stood out. Plus the fact that he'd kept quiet for so long actually made him more credible. Weird how that works, right? Researchers like Paul Cerny and Dr. J. Allen Hynek, big names in UFO circles, took a keen interest. They were struck by the level of detail Shrum recalled and the physical evidence he described. This wasn't just another vague lights-in-the-sky story. Now, sharing his experience changed Shrum's life in ways he didn't expect. Some old friends looked at him differently. Co-workers whispered. But there were positives, too. For the first time in years, Shrum felt less alone with his memories. He found a community of people who'd been through similar things. The UFO research community was buzzing. Could Shrum's account be a key to understanding these encounters? His description of the entities, their tech, and how they behaved. It was a gold mine of data. And get this, the fact that Shrum fought back against the beings made his case unique. In 2004, researcher Preston Dennett published a detailed account of Shrum's experience. This brought it to an even wider audience and sparked new investigations. As more people dug into Shrum's story, something remarkable happened. Instead of falling apart under scrutiny, his account held up. Gradually, Shrum's case started being recognized as one of the most compelling UFO encounters on record. It was mentioned alongside famous cases like Betty and Barney Hill or Travis Walton. But questions still linger. What exactly were those entities? Why were they so interested in Shrum? And here's the kicker. Why did the Air Force work so hard to cover it up? As Shrum's story became part of UFO lore, it opened up new questions about these mysterious encounters and humanity's place in the cosmos. Makes you wonder what else is out there, doesn't it? Donald Shrum's encounter in Cisco Grove still baffles UFO researchers and skeptics today. What were those entities he fought off with arrows and matches? The theories are wild. Some think Shrum stumbled onto a secret government project testing robotic soldiers. Others are convinced it proves aliens are visiting Earth. And get this, a few people even suggest interdimensional beings or time travelers. Wait, what? Now think about it. If even a tiny bit of Shrum's story is true, it turns our understanding of physics, biology, and maybe even human history on its head. That's right. This isn't just another campfire tale. Shrum's account forces us to ask some pretty uncomfortable questions about reality and our place in the universe. Are we really alone? What else might be out there that we don't know about? Let's just say the implications are mind-bending.